I welcome you all. Thank you again, everyone, for being here today. So I'd like us to get right into our conversation for today. I have Andrew Dabalin here, of course, Chief Economist, Africa Region at the World Bank Group. We're going to be unpacking the Africa Pulse report, just to get an insight into the state of the African economy and, of course, from key highlights from that report. Andrew, thank you so much. Good morning for being here.
Good morning.
I'd like us to start with the numbers from the Pulse report. What does Africa's Pulse tell us about the macroeconomic health of the region today? What are you seeing?
First of all, thank you, Esther. Let me join you in welcoming the participants, those who are online and those who are in this room. Turning to Pulse. So last October, we took the pulse of Africa's economies, and we didn't like what we saw. So fast forward 6 months later, here we are. And we still are facing a very difficult environment where the economic activity is sluggish, and for the same kinds of reasons. Growth is declined from 3.6% in 2022 to 3.1%. And if you factor in population growth, it's actually, we're down to about 0.5%, which is not at all sufficient for a region that is, at the moment, really the epicenter of extreme global poverty. And the same kinds of things that were, the same kind of factors that were the basis for our diagnosis about 6 months ago are still lingering. Global demand remains weak. Investments across the board, both public, private, FDI, has basically declined a lot. Inflation remains high, even though, in fact, one of the few things that have kind of been positive is that inflation has peaked, and so it's declining from about 9.7% to about 7.5%. That's the median. Half the countries have less, half the countries have above that. And then interest rates remain high. In fact, they've increased even more. And finally, a lot of these countries are facing really high levels of debt vulnerabilities, which have been increasing, in fact, not gotten better. And so that is squeezing the fiscal space that they have for the broader development activities.
I'm happy you mentioned the issue of debt, because that's been one of the conversations at the spring meetings this year. But tell us, the lack of fiscal space is also a big issue, but we need that. That needs to happen. Countries need to have that fiscal space to reduce poverty. Could you speak to that point?
Yeah, so primarily the lack of fiscal space means that there's going to be a lot of underinvestment in core development activities, right? So just to give you an example, African countries were spending perhaps something close to about 10 to 15% of their revenues in paying down debt. Now they're spending something close to 30%, or even in some cases it's even higher. That's the average. So in some cases it's a lot higher. So when all that money gets diverted to paying debt, it's money you can't spend on education, on health, social protection, food security, agricultural investments, infrastructure investments. So it's for that reason that we think that lack of fiscal space is really detrimental to poverty reduction for a region that really needs a lot of investments to reduce poverty.
Yeah, but African countries still need to borrow. We know that there's a lot to, of course, infrastructure financing and all of that. Where does the World Bank position itself on debt? Talk to us about that. And also concessional loans. Do you think that this could make matters worse for countries who are already saddled with debt? Because right. Obviously they still need to borrow.
Indeed. So obviously, given what I just said about fiscal space and debt, the levels of debt in Africa are worrisome. And in the World Bank, we have been very clear that, in fact, we support a very comprehensive solution to, a comprehensive process for resolving a lot of debt of low-income countries, most of which are in Africa. And there are frameworks that have been proposed. The most common one, the one that a lot of people probably have heard of, is the G20 Common Framework. And the World Bank has been clear that they support that, but have also asked for the process to be faster, deliver real benefits to poor countries, and in fact, in principle, expand it to include a lot more countries that are currently not eligible in the definition of common So in that sense, we are very clear. Now, you've asked this interesting question. Are we actually making the situation worse with concessional lending? So let's put it this way. Just because these countries have high levels of debt vulnerabilities does not mean that the work of development stops, right? The governments still have to provide security. They have to invest in infrastructure, expand access to energy, water, and so on and so on. So in that sense, you're going to have to spend some of that money will come from domestic resources, but let's be realistic, there's still going to be a financing gap. And so where do you fill that financing gap? You could go to the commercial markets, and at the moment, African countries have basically been shut off from commercial markets. The interest rate that they're being asked to pay is double what they were asked only a few years ago. And so that kind of market has been closed off. And so the question then becomes where? So the thing about the concessional loans that the World Bank provides is that usually, unlike commercial loans that are very high interest rates, short maturities, meaning you pay them over a very short period of time, the World Bank loans are ones where the interest rates are very low, and you pay over decades, 30, 40 years. So in some instances, if you really take those two things into consideration, much of that becomes basically grants. And for very low income, high debt countries, we basically give outright grants. So in this time when we have very difficult financial conditions for African countries, we need more and more concession financing, not less.
But that still leaves the issue of how African countries, at the end of the day, after all this said and done, have to create jobs, have to boost economic growth. Yes, we've said that there's little fiscal space. They can still borrow. Of course, there's support of the World Bank, etc. But what are those steps that they need to take to boost growth? I know it's a cocktail, but what perhaps quick wins or immediate steps? Yeah,
the most reliable way to create jobs is to grow. And African countries need to grow and grow really fast and for a long, in a sustained way. And not just growth, but growth that is simultaneously happening in every sector, not just one sector. So in agriculture is growing, services are growing, industry is growing, mining is growing, right? So that's the kind of growth, and the one that creates good jobs, right? So what we've kind of proposed in the report, for that to happen, two things must be in place. One is we must have macroeconomic stability, right? And in some cases, let's be honest, also political and social stability is going to be the foundation for that. Now, when it comes to macroeconomic stability, what we usually mean is we need to bring inflation under control because it's just bad for everyone, but it's particularly deadly for poor people. It reduces consumption. It leads to actions that will, lead to lower investment. So it just depresses economic activity. But we also mean bringing debt under control and stabilizing debt. That could come from mobilizing more revenues domestically, or rationalizing your spending, or being very selective about where you spend, but also being efficient in how you spend. Right? So that's one way to create the foundations for growth. The second, given the environment we are in, public investments are going to be really under strain and probably will have to either be constrained or shrink. So the most urgent thing will be to try and do things to attract private investments. So remove tax schemes or regulatory schemes that favor certain companies, that make market non-competitive. But just in general, creating a business environment that's conducive for private investments. But you could also do this by expanding markets. So integrating will be a very attractive way for businesses to actually try and take a chance on.
Okay. A bit of a gloomy picture, but I want to believe that somewhere in there are some bright spots. So what do you think in terms of how Africa can grow even in this difficult global context? We've said that, you said in the reporter said that inflation has peaked, but there's still risks. But where are those bright spots? Where can we look?
Well, when one bright spot is that it's a hopeful thing. We're hoping that, in fact, the economy will bottom, the economic downturn will bottom out this year. So and if there is a rebound globally, that will lift African economies as well. So that's one bright spot. But actually, even now with this gloomy environment, one bright spot is this process that is underway for low carbon transition, right? And this is, the way to think about this is, so far everything we've lived through or living through at the moment, whether that is, gadgets in our homes or technologies in our factories or even in particular sectors like transport, they've all been running on one type of energy. That's the energy that comes from burning carbon, right? And now you can see that the world is shifting to a transition where that energy is going to come from wind turbines, solar panels, lithium batteries, hydro, and so on and so on. So, the idea is to leave behind burning carbon. But we think about this as just an energy issue, but it is actually going to lead to massive technological transformations in the world. And so it's really, really important. This is an opportunity for Africa because in a lot of these technologies require minerals that Africans have: cobalt, manganese, copper, coltan, right? And it's really, really important for African countries to maximize the benefits to get this through, first of all, they can just get a lot of revenues from it that will stabilize their fiscal issues. They can use this to transform their economies, create value, create jobs. They can coordinate with each other. So it is not something we see it coming. It's not something that African countries can just sit back and be on the sidelines, right? This is something they must participate in because it's really crucial.
But it will take the right kind of policies
at the right
time too.
Yeah, exactly. They have to, first of all, they have to coordinate, they have to cooperate, they have to harmonize certain, tax laws or trade agreements. And then they really need to fix in a real sense, the governance issues that keep coming up again and again and again when it comes to this particular, exploiting these minerals.
All right. Finally, now, Andrew, what are you most optimistic about when you look across the African landscape? I'm just, my mind just going to many of the conversations that have taken place at the spring meetings this year, and it's all, against a global context of weaker growth, even in the long term. But when you think about the African continent and you look across the landscape, what are you most hopeful or most optimistic about?
So I think the thing that gives me hope is that, African countries have now had this long run of, good economic performance. We've hit a really rough patch, but they've had a good run of good economic performance. And what part of that is because of the reforms that have taken place. So internal reforms are going to be crucial. They are always going to be superior to, say, what happens globally, right? Now, I don't want to minimize what global shocks do. I mean, what we've seen in the effect of the Ukraine war and food and fuel and fertilizer prices, what we see with rising interest rates doing to currencies in Africa. So that I don't want to minimize that. But I think domestic reforms are going to be the key because it's domestic reforms that will make agriculture transform. It's domestic reforms that will lead to better outcomes in education. It's domestic reforms that will make your economies more competitive, more productive, and therefore create more jobs.
If I could just comment on that point of reforms, some of the conversations, or what I've also heard at this year's meetings is that this time the reforms are going to be even more painful and will require greater political will.
They will require greater political will.
Regardless, they have to be taken.
Yes, but short-term pain, but maybe long-term happiness.
Long-term happiness. All right. Thank you so much, Andrew. Well, we've come to the end of that conversation. Thank you so much, Andrew. So I've been speaking to Andrew Dabalin, Chief Economist for the Africa region at the World Bank Group, sharing some takeaways and analysis from the Africa Pulse. For more on that report, I believe they're on seats already, but you can go to theworldbank.org/Africa Pulse for more on that report. Thank you again once more, Andrew. Thank you all so much for being here. So I'd like us to go right into our conversation. But I'd like us to start with our first topic, and that's economic outlook and urgency for reforms. You heard my conversation with Andrew a few minutes ago. Reforms are of the essence right now. There's this major urgency for the right kind of reforms to be taken. Victoria Usman, I'd like to start with you with my first question. So can you briefly tell us what is at the top of your mind after speaking to country delegations this week? Victoria, let's go with you.
Thank you. Okay, good. Thank you very much. And good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for this very important conversation. And I'd also like to thank the ministers and our colleague who's here joining us on the panel. Look, we've had very good conversations this past week with all of our countries. I think it's evidence of the strong partnerships that we have with countries in the region. Several issues have come up, but for me, a couple of things that I'm really continuing to reflect on as we close these meetings. The first, of course, is the issues around macroeconomic stability. And I know you've had just a quick chat with Andrew, but at the point of just emphasizing, I just really want to emphasize the importance of this issue, just because it's so foundational for everything that happens on the continent. We heard about the high inflation rates, 14-year high of about 9.2% in 2022. As Andrew said, it seems to have peaked, and we expect that in 2023 it will be lower. We're also seeing the very high interest rates linked to efforts by central banks to rein in inflation. And that in itself has impacts on growth, which is already subdued. We had a setback from the post-COVID recovery with the war on Ukraine that's ongoing. So that's of concern. On the macro front, again, talking about inflation, it's particularly food price inflation, which is really feeding into the food insecurity that we already have on the continent. As we know, this has major implications for the most vulnerable. So that is of concern. We're seeing that the debt has been mentioned, so I won't go into a lot of detail, but the access to financing of almost all the economies is really constrained. And then we have the external accounts where reserve cover is really challenged. So you have macro instability and evidence of increased macro vulnerability of all of these countries, and that's on our mind. It's on our mind, and we're thinking more about what we do as the World Bank to support these countries and to help them navigate this difficult macro context. I think a second area that's top of my mind, and I've alluded to it briefly, is just the huge financing gaps that countries face. Partly because of the debt, partly because of the fact that they've been shut out of international markets, and also partly because the resources that we bring to the table, no matter the efforts that we've made to increase it, either largely, is still largely insufficient. And what we're seeing in a 3-year cycle of IDA, that a lot of the resources have had to be put to work this year. And so in the coming 2 years, we really have a bit of a cliff. So that's a challenge. So in terms of that, even though you have this shortfall, you have a lot of needs, particularly on the infrastructure side. And we know that in the last couple of years, the countries have really been spending a lot for the short-term crises. But now the growth agenda driving growth, the huge infrastructure requirements. And so the top of our agenda really is how to really try and bring in private financing, and how we use the scarce resources that were available on the public side to leverage the private side. And we've been having conversations, including with regional banks, to think about innovative ways to work together to bring more volumes at scale to the financing challenge. Another concern is really the fact that a lot of our countries are off track on key SDG goals. I'll mention 3 of them. The first is really the SDG 7 on access to energy. We still have about 590 citizens on the continent who lack access to energy. And so that's a major concern, and energy is so fundamental for the economic activity, for the growth, for the jobs that need to be generated on the continent. We're seeing in our conversations the countries are really behind on the water and sanitation agenda, which is SDG 6. So this is the only continent in which the gaps on access to water and access to sanitation are not closing. They're actually widening. We have about 37 million more people on the continent without access to clean water, about 247 million more people without good access to sanitation. So that is also of concern. And then the human capital crises, where we're seeing that kids are not learning adequately in school. So those are three areas that are also of concern. So I think coming away from these meetings, we've also seen some sense of resiliency in the countries. We've seen that even in the context of the difficult macro context, you have countries that are really growing fast. I think the Minister of DRC here, DRC is the fastest growing country in the region, about 8% plus, so that's significant. And we're also seeing lots of countries doing reforms, embarking on reforms that are needed. As you said in the earlier conversation, difficult reforms. So there are positive stories out there. It's not all doom and gloom. So in a difficult context, I think there are entry points and opportunities for us to continue to work together to really make sure that the region continues to move forward.
Well, thank you so much, Victoria. Very well said. Mr. Usman, just very briefly, your thoughts, I beg your pardon, your thoughts on top of mind for your conversations that you've had with other participants this year.
Thank you very much, Yoni. And obviously, I heard the same thing as my colleague and friend, Victoria Kwakwa. The context is the same. The reality is also the same. And obviously, because of that, I would totally subscribe to what my colleague Victoria has said. But before sharing with you my own takeaways, I would like once again to congratulate Andrew and his team for the great report. And beyond actually taking stock of what is happening currently in the region, this report is about recommendation, policy recommendation. And therefore, I would like really to invite all the policymakers who are in this room to take advantage of this report and to continue the conversation and also to use it as you are considering to to embark maybe on a new set of reform. This point being made, I always try when I'm in this type of contest to balance a little bit and to shift automatically to French. In my region, I think almost 75% of countries are Francophone speaking, and this will also give the opportunity to the ministers who are here to speak in French when they are invited to do so.
What we have heard during these annual meetings is not very different from what we heard during the annual meetings in October 2022, or even of previous years. We have heard a lot about crisis management in 2021. It was the COVID-19 pandemic. That's all we talked about last year. It was the crisis and the war in Ukraine and its impact with the increase in prices that affected the purchasing power of households. And today we have talked a lot in the region about the impact of the increase of interest rates on the country's ability to leverage the resources they need in order to implement the development program. So when you are in a context of crisis management, unfortunately, you tend to be more reactive, in other words, whereas Africa is a dynamic country, it has huge potential. But when all you're doing is to cope with a crisis, you're in a status quo mode. That doesn't allow you to make the progress that you need. And therefore, what we have discussed, and my colleague Victoria has said so, is that it is extremely important in that situation to remain focused on reform, to learn the lessons from what has happened generally in the past, and to focus on reforms means to pursue reforms that have been initiated in the past. Because what we have found, and there are several examples in a number of countries, is that countries that in the past carried out most reforms were the most resilient countries in this crisis context. Second important point, international institutions have an extremely important role to play, and I think that countries have asked us to step up and to play that role. Of course, we need your financial resources, the resources of the World Bank. Every finance minister I have met said now is the time to increase your resources to provide support, fiscal support, but also to invest further. But what we need essentially is your policy advice. We need your knowledge, your know-how, we need your expertise, we need your analyses. Therefore, the fiscal support that we provide will, I hope, allow countries to come back to a situation where they can act because they are supported with significant structural reforms, and that will allow countries to make the most of the huge potential that they have in the energy sector, for instance. That will allow countries to efficiently invest so that children can go to school, of course, but also so that their children can learn when going to school with the skills that will allow them, of course, to raise the level of the public sector, but that will also allow the private sector to play its role, which is so important in the development of countries. But also see how Africa can make this qualitative jump. Victoria Kwakwa has identified a number of crucial sectors. The digital sector, of course, is important. Digitalization is, of course, by definition, a transformation. And in this context, what we see in countries that have reformed their policies and their regulations, they have experienced extraordinary progress that has allowed them to create jobs, not only jobs to allow young people to keep busy, but jobs that have driving effect on the economy that are significant. The second sector is the electricity sector, or the power energy sector more broadly. And if you look at what Africa has in terms of resources that allows Africa to look forward to affordable, green electricity access, there is a huge potential in Africa. So in terms of the next steps, I would say that the efforts that we need to make together is to continue and pursue reforms and at the same time leverage resources in order to significantly invest in those sectors in order to create what Africa needs most, which are jobs for its young people who have a huge potential, but for whom opportunities have not always been there.
Diagana, moving on quickly, Mr. Coulibaly, let's talk about Cote d'Ivoire's economy. We know that it continues to outperform other West African countries. Last year, registering a growth of 6.7%. Talk to us, what is working for Cote d'Ivoire in a challenging global context? We've heard about, of course, very limited fiscal space, high inflation, high interest rates, and of course that debt overhang. What is working for Cote d'Ivoire?
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much for your question. For Cote d'Ivoire, last year we registered a growth rate of 6.7%. But it's also important to look back and to see that in the past we had far higher growth rates. I would like to just remind you that between 2012 and 2019, the average growth rate was of 8%. With COVID-19, the pandemic in 2020, the growth rate of Cote d'Ivoire was of only 2% in a context of recession globally. So Ousmane earlier talked about resilience, and I think that in 2020, the Cote d'Ivoire economy was resilient with a rate of 2%. In 2021, we saw economic recovery and we reached 7.4%, and then in 2022, 6.7%. I think all that goes to show that we have carried out reform policies, quite strong and ambitious reform policies that have allowed us to create robust fundamentals in terms of macroeconomic stability, in terms of macroeconomic aggregate that have been satisfactory over the past 10 years. And that has been possible simply because of the planning that has been put in place since accession of the President of the Republic in 2011. When the President came to power, he used planning as a tool in order to obtain speedy results. Therefore, as soon as 2012, we had a national development plan for 2012 to 2015, and then we had a second development plan, 2016-2020, and now we have a third development plan, 2021-2025. The reason I'm going into that is because the private sector was a huge driver in that context. The role of the private sector in the national development plan represented 60% of the investments in the first national development plan. Today, at the third plan, the private sector plays or makes investments for 75% of that development plan. So you can see that the state did what was expected and the private sector has taken over. And the reason the private sector has been able to play that role is because we worked very much in the doing business integration. We took important measures in order to reassure investors and make sure that investors were convinced that by investing in Cote d'Ivoire, their investments were safe and legally protected. Then we put in place an investment code that was very attractive, a real incentive that compared why it was better to invest in Cote d'Ivoire rather than in a neighboring country. So that was a strong incentive. And then we also had a single entry point system. So in Cote d'Ivoire, you can set up your company online. You don't have to come to Cote d'Ivoire to set up your company. You can do that through a single entry point. And there is also a single entry point for construction permits, which in fact makes it easier for companies that do want to invest in Cote d'Ivoire to be able to quite easily have access to their construction permits in order to be able to build their industries or their headquarters. We also have a single entry point for external trade. So you see this multiplication of initiatives to make sure that the trade context is a real incentive. And that's why private investments today have been increased threefold between 2012 and now. That's for private investments. That shows that the private investors are drivers of growth in Cote d'Ivoire.
We've also been working in order to improve our sovereign rating with the international credit rating agencies, be it Fitch, Moody's, or Standard & Poor's. We have achieved a better financial rating. We went from B to a double B anchoring, and we're at the highest rating of the continent. If you compare to Botswana and Morocco, we have the best rating over the whole of the continent. And I think this is also reassuring for our partners regarding the business climate, the governance, and the sound management of public finances. I'd also like to mention that through the COVID pandemic, we implemented a mechanism that was extremely efficient. You might know that Cote d'Ivoire was affected by COVID through the outside. We have a single international airport. When we knew that COVID cases were coming to Cote d'Ivoire through this airport, we completely closed down the city of Abidjan, and we set up isolation facilities and healthcare facilities. So COVID was contained in Abidjan. And when we had cases outside of Abidjan, people were brought to Abidjan to be taken care of. So this avoided too widespread a contamination. And the health, the state of emergency that was declared has been raised. And for the time being, we no longer have cases of COVID since the months of January. I'm sorry, I got confused and said AIDS instead of COVID, but we've eradicated 99% of COVID today, so we have lifted the state of health emergency, and we are almost back to normal. In other terms, we still do have to deal with the consequences, because there are still challenges for the businesses that were affected, and that's why we're supporting them. But this is also part of why Cote d'Ivoire is such a resilient country. And I'd like to conclude by adding that we follow very closely the well-being of our population. We have a strong social policy. I'll finish with this. We are also doing a lot of work, because everything goes hand in hand. If you want a strong growth, you also need to make sure that the benefits are shared equally, and that's why we have strong social policy.
And let me come to you, Mr. Kazadi. Now, the DRC has also seen a very strong growth, especially last year, over 8, as a matter of fact, 8.6% in 2022. Now, I know that this growth was supported by higher commodity prices, and you also saw some capacity expansion in your mining sector. But I'd like to know those specific measures that you're taking to have all of this translate into better economic fortunes for the people of the DRC.
Yes, merci beaucoup. La première des choses, effectivement, nous avons...
Yes, thank you for this question. Indeed, we were much more resilient than other countries, as Adama has already mentioned. In 2021, we had 1.7% of growth, and I think we were among 2 or 3 countries in the whole of the African continent to enjoy positive growth rates. There's been a major change in the DRC, which is that since 2019, we are seeing increased demand for our exported products. And this is taking place in parallel with better governance in our country, governance that is more open to dialogue with both private and public partners, a better climate for doing business. And thanks to this opening up, we have sped up some investments in the mining sector, which has boosted growth. And that's why in 2022, we achieved 8.5% growth. For 2023, we are expecting a growth at least as strong, around 8%. And that should stay stable in the medium term. The main turning point in the DRC was domestic resource mobilization for a proper tax collection. In the past, we've had several years of good growth, but which did not translate into increased tax receipts. Between 2020 and 2022, we increased our tax receipts twofold. We went from 8% to 15% of the GDP. Now, that was enabled thanks to increased commodity prices, increased production, but also thanks to transparency in our tax collection policy. We have an increasingly transparent dialogue with the mining sectors. We have a new mining code, which entered into force in 2019, which is fairer for our country, and we now have tax instruments that improve the actual tax collection through digitalization, and that's coming up in a few weeks, standardized billing processes, through the implementation of a special software for non-tax revenue, and we are also diversifying our domestic resource mobilization through new sectors such as gambling or traffic tickets. So we are working in many directions at the same time to increase the efficiency of our tax policy, which has translated into higher tax revenue. On the expenditure side, we have increased our own investment threefold, from 3 to 10% of the GDP. We have also increased external resource mobilization. If you look at our partnership with the World Bank, our main partner, we have increased fourfold our portfolio with the World Bank from 2 billion to 8 billion today. All this time, we also managed to decrease our debt rate. We are under 20% of the debt to GDP ratio. We also are increasing our work on the social policy side. We have made primary education free to all children, and in the past 2 to 3 years, we have welcomed into schooling an extra 2 to 3 million children who were out of school in the past. With the World Bank as our partner, we achieved this extraordinary outcome. We are now trying to rise to the challenge of the quality of education, but this to us is already an extraordinary achievement. And we are also working on other social policy aspects, such as health. We have increased our health expenditure and are looking to go even further. We're also monitoring very closely the transparency of our public expenditure. We were rated as the highest African country in terms of fiscal expenditure transparency. The SDRs that we've received, as many other countries, we still haven't spent everything we have, but we have full traceability to the last cent of all of the money we have spent. The fiscal support is accounted for to the last cent in order to measure efficiency, effectiveness, and performance. So these are our wide-ranging efforts, and thanks to all of this work, we also increased fivefold our foreign exchange reserves. We had 700 million in 2020. We're over 4 billion today. We also managed to control inflation a little better than other countries. However, inflation was 13% in 2022. We were also strongly hit by the crisis in Ukraine. So we did go through a difficult time with inflation, which can be explained by our strong dependency on many imported products, but we were more resilient than some of our neighboring countries. And the new economic challenges that we are facing today is achieve sustainable resilience, to diversify our economy and get out of dependency on the mining sector. And we are implementing the necessary steps to achieve that outcome.
That's very encouraging to hear. Mr. Musoko Twane, let me come to you. Today, more than 60% of Africa's population is under the age of 25. Now, these young Africans are said to be both an opportunity and a challenge for the continent. What is Zambia's strategy to harness this demographic dividend as you also strive to grow the economy?
Thank you very much and for having us. The overall topic that we are discussing today is harnessing natural resources for a sustainable future. And the question then is, how does that relate with the question that you have just raised on how to make the young people to have hope, to have a future? Because indeed, Zambia, like other countries, there's been growth. Last year it was just under 4%. This year we expect something close to 5%. But as other people have said, this growth rate is not enough. It needs to be higher, and it needs to go on for years, as we have seen in East Asia, where growth rate of 6%, 7%, 8% had to go for 30 years for you to see a reasonable dent in levels of debt, levels of poverty going down. But today, I think most of Africa, including Zambia, we have a great opportunity to be able to do something for the young people that you are talking about. And that opportunity depends on where you are. For us in Zambia, just like my neighbor here, I think we are blessed with the presence of the materials that the world needs to be able to gravitate towards the green economy that we wish to see. And that's what we are taking advantage of in Zambia. How do we produce more copper? How do we produce more cobalt? How do you produce more nickel, manganese? Because all these are materials that the world is looking for. And if we can push ahead to produce more, then of course we are beginning to address the issues of the young people. Now, some people would say, but you've been producing copper, cobalt, and so forth for years and years. What's the difference? I think the difference lies in two aspects. The first one is the realization that, in fact, previous policies of thinking that if you are producing primary materials, you are not helping the economy, those notions are wrong. I think for us, we've realized that if you take the example between Chile and Zambia, and I'm sure it's the same with my neighbor here, in the 1970s, we were producing more or less the same quantities of copper with Chile. Then we got to a stage where our production was going down, down, down. I think for Zambia, we got to a stage where we're only producing 1/3 of the copper we used to produce. What the Chileans do? They ramped up their own production. So they picked up the markets. What I'm trying to say here is that it is an important aspect of the economy for you to ramp up production of whatever you can manage to produce. Okay? Whether it is minerals, whether it is agriculture, we've seen other continents. We've seen Vietnam racing from behind to produce more coffee than Africa. We've seen palm oil, which used to be produced in Nigeria. The Malaysians rushing from behind to overtake us. We have to realize that these are mistakes. So if it means producing raw materials, yes, let's produce them because it adds to the economy. Now, therefore, taking into account that, we have asked ourselves the question, why is it that we've been falling behind in terms of copper production? And we've researched in terms of tax policies, because we're obviously taxing way ahead of everybody else, and investors were skirting around us. The regulatory environment, to make sure that licenses are being given timely, we are doing that. Ending corruption in the way in which mining licenses are given. So we are creating an environment that has all of a sudden raised interest in mining sector in Zambia. But beyond that, as we ramp up production of these natural resources, like copper, manganese, and so forth, we are, of course, aware of the fact that it even brings more value if you add value to these materials. So we are working on that. And we are working with our Congolese brothers here to make sure that we have a niche in the production of the batteries, because batteries are going to be very important in the future as cars become less carbon oriented. So that's what we are doing in the case of Zambia. I also want to add that the war in Ukraine, the climate change that has made food to be less available. That is an opportunity for many of us seated in this room, because there are not many other places on this globe where there's still space available for us to ramp up production in grains and whatever food production. So in Zambia, having a small population, more space, we are definitely attracting more investment in agriculture because the market is there. Okay? The market is there. So we are ramping up investment in agriculture, attracting the best farmers that we can get. We are not scared of that. We are attracting the best farmers. If you are a good corporate or whatever farmer, speak to us because we want to produce food so that as Ukraine fails to produce food, at least for the time being, we will be able to supply the food ourselves. So let's get out of the mode of Africa being the continent of tragedy and failure. Let's take advantage of the natural resources that we have, improve our systems, end corruption, improve efficiency. Our goal should not just be to grow 3-4%. Our goal should be like each one of us from Africa. We should transform like the way Vietnam did. We should transform like the way Thailand did. We should transform like the way Mauritius already started. Let's not be satisfied with 3-4%, but when we look around, we see poverty. So transformation. And this is not rocket science because these Asians used to be poorer than us. Okay? You remember that? And they had no natural resources. So what is there with all these natural resources that we have? Why can't we not transform ourselves so that we actually race ahead of the Asians? It's up to us. We are ready in Zambia to do that. Final point, human resources, very important. Again, to take the example of the Asians, they have no copper, they have no nickel, they have no minerals. What do? They invested a lot into the human capital, human beings, because they knew that with these human beings who are capable, that we are training, they can go and buy copper from Zambia, they can go and buy nickel from somewhere else, they manufacture, we sell back to the Africans. Why? Because the human beings, they invested into human beings. So our challenge also is to make sure that we invest into our people. As a point to support that, starting from last year, we have made sure that young Zambians are supported free all the way from primary school to secondary school. How are we doing that? We've actually decentralized money to the constituencies. Every constituency in Zambia gets something like $1.6 million per year. And we tell them, you are the ones who know who amongst yourselves can pay school fees. You are the ones who know amongst yourselves those children who cannot pay school fees. So it's not people in the capital, Lusaka, to decide who to give a scholarship. It is you. Here's the money. Go and choose. And the results are remarkable. Children that used to be left behind are going to school. Of course, the classrooms are now full. So when they complain and say the classrooms are full, there are no desks, we say, but we gave you $1.6 million. You only use 10% to give scholarships to the children. The rest, you, the villagers, find bricklayers, find carpenters, go and build classrooms, go and make desks. So that is also something that is putting money in the rural economy and helping the rural economy to pick up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Musu Kotwani. Very excited to hear these reforms and the experience from Zambia. Damlala, let me come to you quickly. Now, you oversee global progress and providing sustainable energy for all. What does the slowdown in growth and investment mean for energy access in Africa?
Okay, thank you very much. It's a bit daunting with all these finance experts, but I'm going to bring the energy lens, and I think it's important for us to understand the context. Currently, we have about 752 million people without energy at all, of which Victoria mentioned 590 million of those reside in Africa. What is also not mentioned is that 900 million people in Africa do not have access to clean cooking. This affects women and youth disproportionately. And what it means is it's actually our biggest issue when it comes to climate change, because we're chopping up our forest for something as basic as clean fuel. Apart from the issue of how many women die from these fumes that we are inhaling all the time. And that is why it is important for the role we play, especially at the United Nations, to understand that having access to energy is not a nice to have, it is essential for a dignified life. So the average African who does have access to energy barely has 404 kilowatt hours. The average American has 13,000 kilowatt hours. If you put that in context in terms of just performance and growth, you're almost 20 times at a disadvantage being a Black African. And I think it's important for us to understand those figures. So when we come to these forums and do all the great things that everybody on this panel has spoken about in their country, it is at 20 times of a disadvantage because there's nothing you can really do without sustainable energy. So one of the key things that we're doing at Sustainable Energy for All is saying that, okay, fine, everybody's talking about climate change and transition, which is really important, but what does that mean for a low carbon continent? What does it truly mean? What it means is that energy access and development of industry is at the heart of the energy transition. It can't be the other way around. And there's a cost to this. It goes beyond, I just want to provide energy to my power system. What happens to my transport sector? What happens to clean cooking? What happens to the way I build? What happens to the way youth train? We're asking countries to basically green their entire economy, but we're not giving them any more money. And it's important that the first step of what we have to do is understand that data. So we did it for my home country, Nigeria, because it was also a very large oil and gas nation as well. So what happens to the oil and gas? What happens to the jobs? Once we did that analysis, we saw there was no way that Nigeria could to have a full energy transition and uplift 100 million people out of poverty before 2060. It was just not possible. And this is assuming we have, perfect political transitions, all the policies in place. That is what you get. What you also get is basically a price tag of $1.9 trillion, of which at least I know our World Bank colleagues know, at least 410 billion of that money is above business as usual spending. I'm saying these numbers and saying these statistics because I think there's a notion that a lot of these countries don't want to transition or they don't want to go clean or green. It's not the truth. It's the fact that people have to realize what is happening within those countries, and the priority of the country needs to come first in any of the plans that we are doing, and I'm saying me as well because I am on this global platform. We also have to say that, yes, IDA has done great. I used to formerly be in the Nigerian government, so I ran the largest energy access program with Ashish's team. But that's like 500 million. We have like maybe 1 or 2 that's effective. On the continent, we need like 100 minimum to be able to cause this issue, which leads me to the main challenge that we face, and it's the fact that globally, energy access is not seen as a crisis. It has to be seen as a crisis unless we would not find a way to resolve it. So on a more positive note, we've realized that working with government and providing them the right data actually has forced policy and reform. We've also recognized that employing young people to work alongside governments in presidency has forced the implementation growth. We talk about youth in jobs, but we hardly ever talk about youth in government. I was very fortunate to head an agency in my home country at the age of 28. Unless I wouldn't be here now. So we need to encourage that shift of having young people in government helping you fix these problems, because they're the ones on the AIs now, they're the ones that are going to come with these solutions. Finally, I'd like to discuss the role of alternative types of finance. And one is carbon markets, especially African carbon markets. There's an initiative, and most of the countries here are actually on it, called the African Carbon Market Initiative, where it's like, how do you scale up carbon markets in the African continent? How does Africa benefit globally for it? We know it's high integrity. If you are literally taking fuel wood from, a woman's stove, you're not just helping the environment, you're literally saving a life. So there are all these things that we're looking at that, what is the formation? We already have about 250 million of advanced market commitments. We're hoping to have 1 billion by COP, and any countries that really want to come in is important. And lastly, I promise this is last, we also have to understand that there's been a lot of countries like DRC and Gabon who have been preserving their forests. So what is the price of that? What is the price of carbon sinks? It's not just okay. If they were to chop off everything and replant it and then they get money, it's not right. So how do we harness these things and look at Africa as what it is, as an opportunity instead of just an aid project? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Damilola, for that. Round of applause, please. Very insightful. Of course, I'd like us to go deeper into the issue of harnessing Africa's natural resources for a sustainable future, just off the back of what Damilola has said. Victoria, let me bring you in here. In your own words, your own perspective, what would it take for countries to truly benefit from the global demand for green minerals? And I'd like us to, this time, limit our responses to 2 minutes, please.
Oh, 2 minutes?
Yes,
okay.
Thank you.
Well, I think, look, we've started on that question already.
Yes.
With what the Honourable Minister from Zambia has said, and he's spoken very much from the experience of Zambia. But let me add a little bit. I think that already we have experiences and lessons to draw on from the continent, both good and bad. We have what has worked. Botswana is a good example. And we have examples that haven't worked. And so we know what not to do. And we know what helps as well. So I think we should draw those lessons. I think what's really important this time around, as we're really trying to use mineral wealth to promote growth and development, is that we're thinking it's not just mine and send away. It's add value. Add value in country to create the jobs, to add to economic transformation, in addition to providing the revenues. So I think the first thing is to have that mindset, and the Minister has spoken about that already, that as we're drawing on these minerals, so we want to do it in a way that brings some of the beneficiation into the continent and adds the value and creates jobs and transforms that way. The second is really around the regulatory environment and the policy environment. First, to bring transparency so that actors can act in an efficient and competitive way, and also to attract the private investment, both domestic and external, that is needed to harness these resources. And then second, third, also to use regional approaches, as has been used by DRC and Zambia, because it's really important as we're adding value to think about having the value chain, developing the value chain in continent. And usually you can't do that only in one country. So you're thinking about the upstream, which is a production of inputs, whether it's a machinery for the sector, and then you're thinking about the mining itself, and then you're thinking about processing of the mineral proceeds. And all of that works better in small countries, small economy context, if you have a regional approach. So policies that encourage regional action, regional trade, we have the Continental Free Trade Area that should promote that. So that's also something that we have to look at. And then Minister touched also on skills, building the skills that are important and needed, not just to mine, but also to be able to do the forward linkages and the backward. Why not production of machinery? Why not producing the lithium batteries and so on? So these are a few areas that are really critical that have to be looked at to be able to draw the resources. I think a final point is managing the resource revenues in a way that it doesn't cause macro distortions and also lead to lack of competitiveness in other sectors of the economy. And that happens very easily. That we're so focused on that one particular mineral that we're not looking at how we're managing on the macro side and therefore creating problems and lack of competitiveness for other sectors. So resources or mechanisms to stabilize revenues and the use of revenues from the minerals is also going to be important. So just wanted to add the macro aspect as well. I see you're telling me to stop, so I'll stop.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Mr. Diagan, I'd like to bring you in here. Now, obviously, no doubt the right policies will help a lot in helping African countries to tap into those resources and, of course, make them benefit the economies. But at the meetings this year, we've also heard about, there's also been emphasis on learning from the past boom and bust cycles. We know that many African countries, Nigeria, for example, we've seen the case with Nigeria. So it can either be an opportunity or the very opposite of it. So in thinking about those lessons that, perhaps in your country you've learned, how are you thinking about them? How are you integrating them into your policies to ensure that it becomes just an opportunity and not the opposite?
No, je vais commencer par...
Thank you. I would like once again to congratulate the ministers on the initiatives that they have taken that have allowed their countries to not only be resilient in times of crisis, but in certain cases to actually embark on a path of growth at a time where the world was in recession. And I think here reforms are particularly important. Now, to reply to your question, firstly, I think we need to capitalize on success stories, and there are some in Africa. We've talked about important challenges that mean that Africa is lagging behind when it comes to the percentage of people who have access to electricity. Some years ago, the same issue arose in the context of access to water. African countries at the time carried out extremely important reforms in the water sector, including when it came to the management of water companies that are responsible for production and distribution of water. And a lot of progress has been made in that respect. So good experiences are not necessarily outside Africa. Sometimes they exist within Africa. We should also refer to what is happening today in the digital sphere. It is true that we started quite low down, and therefore, although there has been progress, we tend to have a pessimistic view rather than an optimistic one and see the glass half full, and we don't sufficiently highlight the important progress that has been achieved in that area. And therefore, what I want to say is that through what has been done in certain sectors of Africa, in particular access to electricity with very good management, very good governance, and the possibility for African countries to also use what they have as a potential, be it in the hydro, in the wind sector, in the solar sector, and all that coupled with a trade climate that is tightened, that should, I think, allow us to foresee improvement in access to electricity so that SDG 7 can be met in Africa. So I want to see the glass half full here. But for this to happen, it has to take place with good fiscal management and consolidation. And when this happens in a situation where there is a huge population growth, trade-offs, decisions, strategies are essential. Targeting is essential. You have to see the difference between what is urgent and essential and what can come second. You have to focus on the the right policies and fill gaps. Try and invest at that level so that you can make the expected progress. I can't go into more detail because I only have 10 minutes. Thank you very much.
Coulibaly, let me bring you in here. Now, Cote d'Ivoire is part of the West Africa Power Pool, a successful example of regional integration. Now, what lessons do you draw from the prospects of regional value chains and trade in energy, extractiveness, and other sectors? I know a bit of that has been spoken about, but I'd like to hear your experience.
Ok, d'accord, très bien. Vous savez, j'ai parlé tout à l'heure du fait que la...
Thank you very much for your question. I said earlier that Cote d'Ivoire experienced rapid growth, and this is possible only through energy, abundant and cheaper energy. And to give you the example of the West Africa Power Pool that indeed exists, it is a regional integration project for electric networks of the ECOWAS countries. And this project works very well. It was put in place for the right reasons, because the energy production per country is costly, and it places countries, or poses them to independent producers, and often they cannot individually discuss with the independent producers to try and lower the cost of energy. So it was very important for us to actually pool together and to have this regional project, which is a powerful tool of regional integration as well. And in the context of developing value chains, we face two obstacles and barriers. Firstly, the lack of harmonization, strategic harmonization between the different countries. And this failure to harmonize our strategies is a major constraint. And if we overcome that, then we avoid countries working alone and weakening their position. Second constraint, the logistical capabilities. When you produce electricity, you don't need to just produce electricity. You have to store it, you have to transport it, and then you have to distribute it. And that chain is not always very fluid. So if countries have to do it alone and individually, it can be a constraint. I dream of a strategy that would allow countries to be specialized in certain parts of the value chain, rather than to have each country having to build its own autonomous capacities. I think that would be the ideal solutions, because we do not individually have the capacity. Energy is costly, and most countries are committed to reforms of structural transformations of their economy through industrialization. How can you speak of industrialization if you do not have access to abundant, cheaper energy? So we really need to work together. And I think that this idea of the West Africa Power Pool can be a good example for the rest of the continent. Thank you. That's what we want.
Let me come to you, Mr. Kazadi. Now, we know that many natural resource projects are located in remote and rural communities. And, of course, that provides job opportunities in that respect. But I'd also like to hear, perhaps you could speak to that point, and also attracting private capital also into the mix. Your thoughts?
Oui, très bien. Effectivement.
Yes, thank you very much. The Republic of Congo is seen as a country that has many forests, and everybody wants to preserve those forests as there are. But there are also people, and there are development ambitions, and you have to, of course, accommodate all that and see how best manage the situation.
Currently, if you're speaking about energy, if we don't resolve all our energy needs, we will not be able to achieve a forest preservation. We have around 100 million inhabitants in our country, and we need to make sure that we are not damaging the forest because we didn't find any satisfactory solution to our energy needs. And as I said to Victoria Kwakwa yesterday, history will judge us. Our own citizens and our partners will judge us. Our country has huge potential in energy production, yet we have one of the lowest energy production rates in the continent. That's why we need to change our mindset. Why am I saying this? Well, because usually we use excuses such as governance challenges or insufficient capacity, and then we don't do anything. But if we do not make progress here, this will be a loss not only for DRC, but for the world as a whole. We need to overcome our capacity constraints. We need to have more aggressive public investment, and we need this public investment to mobilize private investment, which is absolutely essential. When it comes to private investment, we need to improve our business climate. We also improved our rating with Moody's and Standard & Poor's, and it took us under 12 months last year. We jumped from C to B. We want to make the DRC an attractive destination for investments. When I speak of our energy needs, we need to find a solution also for social reasons. As Victoria Kwakwa said, we need to increase local value added. We have ongoing projects to process our natural commodities. We have joint projects with Zambia. We're trying to manufacture batteries, cables, many different parts. We are making progress. It's very costly in terms of energy that we should produce ourselves. Now, why is that essential? Because this is our contribution to global climate challenges, but we're also doing it because we have the potential to do it. It's 3 times as competitive to produce our own energy rather than import it from China, the US, or Poland, or elsewhere. And producing our own energy in the DRC is also essential for another reason, because until now, even if our poverty figures are moving in the right direction, the absolute number of people under the poverty line is still increasing. And the only way to get all of these individuals out of poverty is through industrialization. And that's why we need to get things going right away. It is vital for us if we want to get people out of poverty and give our contribution to global climate challenges. This is how we need to act. And that is precisely what we're doing. We are setting up a free economic zone in the Katanga region. Another special economic zone is setting up for coltan and gold near the Kivu region. We are the first coltan producer in the world. We don't have good figures for that yet because everything was done in a very opaque and non-transparent manner, but we are now transforming this mineral at the national level. We've implemented better transparency in the value chain, and this is also good in terms of governance.
If I could just ask you, now, earlier on you spoke about ramping up production, you talked about also value addition around minerals like copper and manganese. But I'd like to ask you, with all of that happening, and as you begin to or take further steps to harness your natural resources, what is the big picture for you in terms of how that is going to transform the Zambian economy? What can we look forward to 5, 10 years down the line? What kind of shape could that give the economy?
Thank you very much indeed. Obviously, the ramp up of the production of those materials creates jobs. The value addition that we are aspiring to do creates jobs. But also, this gives opportunities in other sectors of the economy to create jobs. The energy sector, for example, because with the more mining, you need to produce more electricity. And that means that we can ramp up on the hydro, we can ramp up on the solar. We look forward to our neighbors in Congo doing something on the Inga Dam. I don't know when. But these are all opportunities that can also help to integrate our economies. Also, with increased mining, there are opportunities because you can imagine, I think my neighbors are already producing 2 million tons of copper. We are racing ahead to catch up and even do more. You can imagine the logistic challenges that come with that. Okay? How to evacuate these minerals from Central Africa, where we are, to the ports, whether it is Walsh Bay, whether it's Dar es Salaam or wherever. the opportunities that will be created for employment in the railway sector are enormous. Of course, the railways were there, the colonial railways, which were allowed to go down because they had nothing to carry when the mineral production went down. I'm happy that our Angolan neighbors, they are fixing the railway line. I'm sure they will be sending some of their copper there. We'll also do the same. It also creates opportunities for, again, our Angolan friends to do an oil refinery. At the moment, all these refineries that we had were too small. They could not compete with the large refineries out there in the Gulf. But as we get more money from the mineral production, it would make sense for them to upscale on the refinery. And we also would be very happy to buy fuel, not from the Gulf, but from our neighbors, which means jobs also being created in the neighborhood. So the economies now begin to reinforce each other, and we all become better off. Thank you.
That is so good to hear. Mr. Kazari, in 5 seconds, I want you to answer the question that Mr. Musokutwani asked you. When is that going to be? 5 seconds, please.
Yes, on Inga. Oui, d'abord, Inga, il y a deux choses. Il y a Inga.
Now, on Inga, I wanted to say two things. There is Inga 1 and Inga 2. And the current capacities are only at half of total potential capacities. And then there is this crazy dream of a large Inga project. But what we need to do first is reopen all of the turbines and fulfill existing capacities. And that can be done under 12 or 24 months. And then we need to revitalize the large Inga project. We now have a good political climate. We are ready to have projects at 5 or 10 years term. We need also to achieve consensus from our financial partners, and we're hoping that the World Bank will fulfill its role and our expectations. And then we also need to attract private operators. We need to speed things up to fully make this into a reality. Now, Inga won't achieve results in 5 years. I mean, large Inga project, we're banking on 8 years. But we can't wait 8 years to electrify everyone in Congo, everyone in Africa. Things need to kick off now with micro dams, with solar power, with all of the off-grid possibilities, because it is a question of emergency. The previous speaker said that it was a crisis of access to power. And that's why every day, every month, every year counts. That's why we need quick win solutions at the local level. In the DRC context, now we are host to half of unsalted water in the continent. And we've identified a dozen places where we can set up hydro dams. We can do that straight away to electrify villages and local communities, all the while working on the large Inga project. Thank you very much, Mr. Gaz.
I do beg your pardon. 15 seconds. That is there a credible path for more sustainable energy access in Africa?
Of course there is. I mean, you can see by the wonderful work the country is already doing, but it can't happen without financing. So there needs to be a lot more financing, and there's a role to play for making sure that it's not just last mile. It is also transmission, distribution, the utilities have to be functioning, and the power pools have to be functioning.
Well, what would it take for us to move at a faster pace?
Money.
Money. I want
money and policy, but money.
But money primarily. Okay, we have about 3 minutes left. Victoria and Mr. Musa.
I will react to her point on money because we are talking to the World Bank here. So
oh, she's in good company.
Pour l'énergie secteur, pour les 4 dernières années, la banque.
Now, in the past 4 years, we've increased fourfold our commitments in the energy sector. And I am only speaking here of the World Bank, not the World Bank Group. I'm not talking about what IDA and MIGA are doing. We have invested $14 billion, and our goal is to double the access capacity in the region by 2026. Now, these figures are also drivers to leverage other types of financing resources. But we need, in counterpart, our partners to commit to reforms. That's crucial. And what is also necessary is that the absorption capacity be strengthened to make sure that the programs are carried out in a timely manner. There's a lot of delay. Some projects are 10 years behind. So this feeling of emergency, it is crucial, because beyond the disbursements, we need to achieve actual results.
So if you'd like to continue the conversation...
for you, sir.
Well, I'll take it. I'll take it. If you'd like to continue the conversation online, please post your comments using the hashtag Africa. So that's for our online audience who have been watching. Thank you so much to everyone, and we'll leave it there. Thank you for being here today. All right. Thank you.